Oh, so you were there.
I taught until 5. I was happily
And you are still here.
I'm happily teaching Song of Solomon, looking at Chagall, it was a whole production. And then I did it. I apologize for being late.
It was in a good cause.
Thank you. And also thank you for a very balanced, neutral report from you on this topic.
I have my former dean here sitting, so I have to watch what I
But
I have to leave early, and then you can unleash it.
so you have your former dean, I have
That's
my
yours.
current dean, and you came so late.
Yeah.
Well, of course you don't blame me, you blame Hamid. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming and being here. I should say my name is Ali Mirsapasi, and I would like to now formally welcome you on behalf of Kevorkian Center, Iranian Studies Initiative, and Gallatin School for this very, very special event that you will see. My apologies for starting half an hour late. I was under the impression it's traffic, but our colleague, the author, was involved, it seems, in global affairs and was just half an hour late. Before I introduce our speakers and today's events format, let me remind you that our next event, which would be on October 26, 2 weeks from today, same time, same place, is a talk on Iranian protests through comparative lens. The speaker is Muhammad Ali Katibar, a sociologist of social movement at Boston College. And the discussant is our colleague at NYU, Mona Al-Bobrashi, and the moderator is another colleague from NYU and this building, Arang Keshavarzian. I think I can blame Hamid and for giving you a very brief bio of our esteemed colleagues. They are very well known and renowned, but I'm sure as we discuss, hopefully we will learn more about them as well. Hamid Dabashi is a professor of Iranian studies and comparative literature at Columbia University. I have a long list, but let me give you a summary of Hamid has written about 22 books.
Who's counting?
Yeah, but it's not less than 22, it's more than 22. And hundreds of articles and public writings and appearances. And I know that most of us have been following his works for a long time. Two of his books that were published both this year. One that I have read half of it, but also heard you talk about the book and inspired me to go and read the book is the Persian Prince, the rise and resurrections of the imperial archetype, a wonderful, wonderful, I should not say encyclopedic, because sometimes we use this to say it's a general reference book. It's a conversation basically with intellectual, political world over time and places. And at the same time, it's a very timely book for if anybody is interested in intellectual debates and politics in Iran. The second book is the book that we are here, have gathered to discuss, An Iranian Childhood, Rethinking History and Memory. Although, as you see, I had comments about your work and the book, but there is one comment I have to make, and that is that this particular book is very special for me because one of the colleagues who is perhaps, I shouldn't say responsible, who put pressure on me or perhaps, and later inspired me to write my own memoir, was Hamid. The first time I sent a very raw draft, I think I got about a single page, 10-page or something comments from you. And I said, oh my gosh, this must be very good. I began reading, and but also I had a small part in publication of this book. This book, Hamid's memoir, was published as part of a series that I co-edited for Cambridge University Press. Let me say this one thing, sorry, and then I will not say anything about Hamid or Hamid's book. And that is that when Hamid sent us his proposal for the book, or it may be the second draft of the proposal, which was about 60 pages, I just felt that somebody has to publish that. I still think there are some really fascinating discussion about memory and forgetfulness, and about the sort of political history of Iran. Of course, you see an extended version of it in the book, but I still think that Hamid should do something that most people that I don't usually like they write Clash of Civilization or End of History as an article and then becomes a book. I think for the first time, now you have written a book, now publish the article. I don't know whether this is legally or morally justified, but it's a wonderful book. We have some copies of the book, and I'm sure Hamid would kindly sign the book for you, and please pick up a copy. We have two wonderful colleagues here who are discussing. These are our colleagues and Hamid's colleague, Professor Bruce Robbins of also Columbia University, a professor of humanities at Columbia, also comparative literature. He is a very renowned professor and works in the areas of 19th and 20th century fiction, literary and cultural history, and post-colonial studies, very close to what Hamid does. Two of his recent books are Um, Cosmopolitanism, it's a co-edited book that I'm not a institutional chauvinist, but I was pleased to see that NYU Press published that book. I have also published one book by NYU because I felt guilty not publishing, and actually had a great experience. And the other book that was also published in the same year. So the panelists share quite a lot in common, is Beneficiary. That book, it was published by Duke University Press. And we have our a colleague, Professor Atefe Akbari, also a good friend and colleague for many years now, who graduated from Columbia and is a professor of comparative literature or English, right, at Barnard University, which is really Columbia. So we basically have a Columbia crew today here. Professor Akbari currently is finishing a book project titled From the Caspian to Caribbean, toward a plenary comparison of literature. Very comparative literary title. It's a cross-cultural comparison of mid and late 20th century Iranian and Caribbean fiction and poetry. I have to say that, Atif John, when I read this, I said, this is a very young person talking about our time, Hamid, as if this was a really many centuries before, but a great work. Iranian studies need to, scholars need to do by far more comparative work that we have been doing. I end this introduction. I had more, but there is one more thing I need to do, and then our panelists will start. The format, if everybody agrees, is that Professor Lawrence starts, and you would have about 15 minutes, and the same for you, Atif John. Each panelist will discuss the book, or I'm hoping, or maybe they are interested in posing some questions for Professor Dabashi. But after their discussion ends, then Hamid John, you would, I personally would like you to say something about the experience of writing the book, a sort of history of the book, which is always very fascinating. And of course, your reflections about materials in the book, and also discussion of some of the arguments that our panelists discussed, or response to their questions. And then if you would like to respond, both of our panelists can briefly respond, and then we open it for questions and answers. Is that?
Can I argue a little bit? I just wonder, maybe you'd like to hear Hamid read a little bit from the book, so you get a taste of it. Would you mind?
Absolutely not. With a pleasure.
Try not to look at. Don't look at my notes.
But then you will start. That would be.
Yeah. So. First of all, let me again apologize sincerely for being late. As I said, there was a situation on our campus. So I'm going to just read, a couple of paragraphs from the beginning, The title of the prelude is Myself as Another, which I borrow from Ricoeur. I describe why. The section prelude begins with a poem of Rumi from Masnavi. همچون میل کودکان با مادران سر میل خود نداند در زبان. Just like the longing of children for their mothers, they know not the secret of the desire in their lips. And this is I read a couple of paragraphs. I have a terrible memory. I cannot remember what I had for dinner last night, as my late mother used to say, but I remember vividly the day my aunt Gohar, may she rest in peace, though she was not a very nice person, told my mother there was no available seat for me in any of the old boys elementary school in my hometown Ahvaz, but that she had arranged for me to attend an all-girls school. My aunt was an official in the Department of Education in our province, and this was in the mid-1950s in Iran, and the schools were then, as they are now, gender segregated. Boys with boys and girls with girls. Boys had no female teachers, and girls had scarce any male teachers. I spent the first year of my public education in an all-girl elementary school, Dabestan Urdibehesh. It was called. Tavana بود هر که دانا بود. Whoever has knowledge has power. A line from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh.
Foucault was there.
This is 1,000 years before Foucault. Was the very first complete hemistich of poetry I could decipher on our school sign. I have no clue what I had for dinner last night, because my memory, or amnesia to be precise, works that way, or perhaps most memories work that way. There must be reason, as Dr. Freud would smilingly say. I remember certain things and have forgotten certain other things, but I will not be too busy psychoanalyzing myself in this book. I am not qualified. So this fact of my selective memories is what it is, and I have been perfectly fine with it. There is no psychopathologizing myself. And I can tell you now, all I can tell you now is that this book you have kindly considered reading is an adult person's remembrance of his own childhood and a reflection on what he remembers about that childhood. This is an autobiographical meditation, you might say, located somewhere between memory and history, which has now emerged as a major scholarly discipline. I don't wish to theorize that discipline. I want to perform it. The adult and the child you'll encounter in this book are, of course, closely related. They are the same person. I am the same person. I am that child who has grown up. As that child you are about to meet is me, so many waxing and waning moons ago. There is a child author in me, and there is an adult author in me. As an insightful colleague who kindly read the initial idea of this book once observed, and they compete for my attention as I write. This is a friendly competition, like improvising jazz. They are not at odds with each other. One is very visual, the other very verbose, again in the same colleagues adroitly observed. These peculiar relationships between me at 70 and me in my early childhood, these two dramatis persona, as it were, works on the borderlines of memory and history, facts and remembrances of facts, realities and the simulacra of realities. In this book, I wish and I plan to tell the story of an Iranian childhood, not the Iranian childhood. Who am I to say anything like that? Just one Iranian childhood, which is my own. The reason and the path through which I'll tell this story perforce passes through my memory and our collective history, personal and public, poetic and political. There are things that I will tell you about me you would not have known, and there are things that I will tell you about Iranian history of which you would be aware, but not in this particular twist. In other words, the interface, the rendezvous between me as an aging scholar and critical thinker and me as a child creates a peculiar tertiary space. an interstitial space between memory and history, in which I plan to tell you this story. This relationship between me and me, therefore, becomes the story of me as another person, me and my other, me and my shadow, me and my doppelganger, as it were. Me in the mirror of myself, in which I see many others too. I have been thinking about this book for quite some time and about the prose that it would inevitably require. Bless you. And I am lucky, my editor and my colleagues, who considered the idea of this book thought it worthy of their, and hopefully your, attention. The book has therefore required and ascertained a peculiar kind of prose rooted in my academic background and the theoretical cast of my mind, and yet, at the same time, confident in the memorial recollections it wishes to share.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so I hope you're as glad as I am that you got a taste of this book, which is, as you can tell, very analytically profound, but also very tender and very funny. And all right. And now I shall read something. Actually, I'll say one more thing for NYU, just following up on the introduction. The project from which that collection of essays on cosmopolitanism that made possible that collection was an NYU project. So sponsored by NYU, people brought in to talk about various forms of cosmopolitanism around the world. Reading your book, I wish that there had been a Shia cosmopolitanism element in it, but there wasn't. Anyway, so just to say that NYU pride in all kinds of ways. I was just a toddler, Hamid writes, when the CIA MI6 engineered coup catapulted the democratic fate of our country into a dark future. The coup of 1953, before Hamid was old enough to be aware of what was going on around him, is nevertheless an organizing principle of his life and of the book. Again, he writes, the first crucial decade between 1953 and 1963 marks our childhood, with the Shah being deposed, the Shah being returned, and the Shah being a catalyst to the fate of an entire generation, richly mapped out in the poetry and the politics of a nation aware of its failures and determined in its aspirations. So the phrase, our childhood. The premise, and it's a bold premise, is that remembering one's own childhood is connected in some profound and important way with trying to make sense of his nation's history. A distinctive pleasure of this very pleasurable book is the connecting, as indicated in its title, of a childhood and a nation. Not just in the weak sense, this is a childhood that happened in Iran, was lived by a citizen of Iran, but the book is much more interested in a stronger sense of connection. This is a personal history that is tied in various unpredictable ways to a national history. And that's a level of connectedness that's more daring. It's the premise, I'm a literature person, so forgive me, that Salman Rushdie was taking as a source of serious comedy in his novel Midnight's Children, a novel about childhoods that literally began at the instant of Indian independence and were lived, at least from the perspective of the protagonist, in intimate relation to India's first 3 decades, up to and including Indira Gandhi's emergency. Rushdie uses this cosmic coincidence as a source of comedy, but at the same time, he also does take it quite seriously as something like the allegory of a generation. And I think the same can be said, or at least, let's say I'm throwing out the speculation, can the same be said of an Iranian childhood? Like Midnight's Children, an Iranian childhood has certain suspicions of allegory. It insists that surface not get lost in explorations of deeper meanings. That's a point raised about the beautiful Surawardi story, Treatise on the State of Childhood. Tell the people how that goes in Persian, because it's an incredible story. I forget.
The 11th century Iranian philosopher Sohrawardi has a number of treatises in Persian. Most of his writing, philosophical writing, is in Arabic, and these are mostly allegorical. And this particular treatise is, during the childhood, I was standing on a street corner, and it's a group of children were going. I said, "Where are you going?" He said, "Well, we're going to school, to our teacher, to learn knowledge." I said, "What is knowledge?" He said, "I don't know. Ask our teacher." So this is how the story begins. It's a absolutely extraordinarily beautiful allegory, and that he turns it into a whole different realm. So yeah,
it's a very, very powerful way to get this book going. Anyway, but there is some suspicion of allegory in the discussion of this allegorical story. The suspicion of allegory comes up again when he talks about childhood rhymes, where he makes the point that it's the form that counts much more than the meaning of the words. Hamid vigorously resists any simple binaries of the East-West sort that allegory sometimes encourages. Still, with all that said, it's hard to stay completely away from allegory. So he writes, "For my generation of Iranians, it has become impossible, I have concluded, for the personal not to be political, or the mundane symbolic at one and the same time. We have all become our own political allegories." It's a strong statement. I can't help but add that this book, again like Rushdie's, can be very funny, and not just in its treatment of allegory. So I'm going to read, actually, well, I won't read it as well, one of my favorite passages, which comes toward the end in Hamid's adolescence, when he starts making money writing essays for fellow students and then love letters for fellow students. So it's a business, right? Students who do not have the same gift for prose that he clearly started to have very, very early. I was quite good at wordsmithing in the subject we called insha in high school, composition of essays on various subjects. Soon I was asked to write compositions for my classmates, and that eventually developed into a small business, whereby I could charge something like a penny or so for a lovely essay on the benefits of cows, or how my customer had spent his summer, etc. When puberty kicked in, and my friends and classmates began falling in love with the neighborhood girls, my business expanded into writing truly passionate love letters for about a nickel or so. This was quite a brisk business for a while, and soon I discovered that when I began writing a love letter, I was genuinely falling in love with the invisible person to whom I was writing the letter. Love magically disappeared, however, as soon as the next customer began telling me about love affair. I had in the process become a therapist of the sort, advising my customers from the vastness of my own non-existent experiences, which I had gained by listening to my friends sharing their innermost affections for one neighborhood girl or another they had seen from the rooftop. In the process, I had also become the confidant of all my friends' secret love affairs, and glorious was the day when one of my customers had received a letter in response and was rushing to increase my rate for an insanely beautiful response. Ghostwriting my friends' love letters led to quite a number of eventual engagements and subsequent marriages. This is really good. So, awkward segue. As far as the analogy goes between personal history and national history, something that is never more than a subtle shadowing here, I want to add that this piece of writing itself, the book, does not aim at one of the eventual engagements and subsequent marriages that are the endpoint of the money-making writing business. So there's some lovely writing about Hamid's children, one of whom I had the pleasure to teach. But the memoir is not, like so many novels, about the establishing of a family, about the establishing of a new social unit. And because many memoirs, I think, are, as novels are, it's worth saying. At its center, I would say, is education. Something that, for those of us who are educators, we can appreciate. But unlike other stories of education, and this maybe is a particular interest of mine, especially stories that begin in the provinces, as this one does, and feature families of origin that have not been educated, as this one does. This is not a story of departure from the provinces and from the uneducated family. And this, even though it ends literally with Hamid's departure for Tehran to pursue his studies. Hamid is very explicit about not considering himself an exile, whether globally or domestically. And the memoir is very self-conscious about not considering that education has to be a form of exile, something he really might have thought, exile from the uneducated or the less educated. As Hamid presents his parents, who don't know how to read or write, they are already very much in possession of Iranian culture. They're possessors of Iranian culture in the form of oral tradition. That seems to me, as an outsider, key to the extraordinary happiness of this depicted childhood. In a sense, then, all his education and his subsequent scholarship doesn't mean leaving behind the uneducated parents. It means returning to them, but in some mysterious way, having enriched or rendered explicit a culture that they already possessed. And it's in this sense, as well, I'm sure, as in other senses, that the memoir excites an allegorical pleasure, a sense of grasping a vision of the nation at the same time as it's grasping a vision of an individual life. So the nation as something to stay with, even at a physical distance from, something like that. Another virtue I appreciated very much in an Iranian childhood was the way, in handling the trajectory of the nation, which it does, it balanced foreign intervention, as in the 1953 coup, with domestic forces and ideologies which have their own dynamics and trajectories. Iran's domestic ideologies and dynamics, especially the richness and complexity of Shiism, are an area of immense ignorance for me. I was very glad to have a window opened in reading this book, but I can't pretend really to say anything about these subjects. I mean, I hope you will, or we can. But I would like to throw out one speculation. So this is a quote which I was intrigued by. Precisely at the moment when Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic Republic were putting the final nail in the coffin of societal modernity, Abbas Kiarostami and Shirin Neshat, as two prominent examples inside and outside Iran, went vicariously postmodern and excessively formal in their art and aesthetics. And the result, Hamid says, was schizophrenic bipolarity. And you get to schizophrenic bipolarity because of the absence of a bona fide social modernity. So just to say really quickly what interests me, what's the connection between this aesthetic achievement, which is really a form of greatness, obviously, and the kind of predicament of Iranian society? How much satisfaction can we get from this? I mean, just, I guess I'll pose that to you as a question. And it comes up again, and I think I'll end with this. Hamid and I share an admiration for Edward Said, who's talked about in the book, and we shared a friendship with Edward Said for all kinds of reasons. Edward Said is someone who I think is on many minds right now. But one thing we don't share is our feelings about the word secular, a word which Said took as a motto and that Hamid rejects as not really meaningful. And what Hamid substitutes for secular, if I understand him correctly, and I'm not sure I do, is poetic. So for both of us, I think aesthetics or poetry or literature has a function of reconciling or appearing to reconcile seemingly irreconcilable values and commitments. So, yeah, I mean, I can't even think of a good question about that. except that I would like to hear you say more about it. I had something about Alexander the Great, but I think I'm going to skip that. I remember you
Oh,
talking about Alexander the Great.
thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have a little bit to say about what I see as the secular. So
Great.
also so glad that you read for us at the beginning, because it does give us a sense of his prose, which is something that I would like to talk about as a literature scholar. I also should apologize. I'm going to be doing some close reading and some comparative close reading, because I can't help but compare. Yeah, I'll start. I don't know what sin we have committed in this godforsaken place. I'm sick of everything, even of the unrest. I wish I'd been born in the most remote place of the world so that my entire life wasn't affected by political conditions. These were words typed by one of my dearest friends from back home in Iran on November 15th, 2022. So 3 months into the Women Life Freedom movement. In a WhatsApp group chat that her and I have with a third friend, all of whom went to high school together. I start my brief remarks today about Hamid Dabashi's book with these words uttered by my friend, because I think they perfectly embody two central ideas in your book. One is about the sacred and the secular, and the other is how, as Bruce quoted, it is impossible for the personal to not be political. So although with regard to the latter, Hamid writes, for my generation of Iranians, it has become impossible, I have concluded, for the personal not to be political, and this is what Bruce read as well, or the mundane, symbolic, all at one and the same time. It remains true for my generation as well, who were born in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution in the midst of the 8-year Iran-Iraq war, and therefore referred to as the burnt generation. And our lives since we were teenagers have been punctuated by protests against the state that have turned more deadly over the years, prompting mass exoduses, which is why I am here. And I'll return to the seemingly mundane statement, I am here, at the end of my remarks. But first I want to touch upon the personal and the political and its relation to the text message by my friend. So in Memory for Forgetfulness, which Dabashi mentions as a critical text for his own process of working through memory and history in his book, his first chapter is in fact called My Memories of Our Forgetfulness. The Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish writes, I want the aroma of coffee. I want nothing more than the aroma of coffee. And I want nothing more from the passing days than the aroma of coffee. The aroma of coffee so I can hold myself together, stand on my feet, and be transformed from something that crawls into a human being. So coffee simultaneously acting as an anchor to and a desire for the mundane becomes symbolic of a people robbed of the mundane and by extension of their humanity. A few pages later, Darwish writes, coffee is geography, which was the same desire expressed by my friend in her text message. And in this same vein, Darwish writes of going to buy groceries as a child and hearing a song sung in the streets about the nationally beloved Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was, as some of you may know, forcefully removed in a coup orchestrated by the CIA and the MI6 in 1953, the organizing principle of his book and his childhood, as Bruce mentions. In this song that is sung by hired thugs, Mossadegh is referred to as a pimp. And little Hamid, upon returning home, asks his mother what that word means. To which his mother responds with a giggle, never mind, my sweet. Did you get me fresh parsley and mint? Dabashi then writes, my mind and soul are full of these memories, delightful, fearful, traumatic, historic, and definitive to our national psyche. And I wish to share them in a way that would mean something beyond their immediate significance in my own life. About half a century after that watershed historical moment that led to the creation of those childhood memories and changed the course of modern Iranian history, and therefore all of our lives and subsequent memories, I am, I believe, effectively sharing what those memories and that unique prose that you've created in order to share those memories mean to myself and my generation beyond their immediate significance in your life. So I would like to give an example of what I'm referring to as your unique prose in the term secular, about which you write, I have no idea what it could really mean in any non-European or more specifically non-Christian context. And instead you decide to play with the word and see what it can do to help you navigate the space between the sacred and the poetic. So while the way you do it in this book is by providing examples from the poetry of Forough Farrokhzad, among other things, I want to draw your attention to how he, in my opinion, inhabits this same space between the sacred and the poetic with your writerly prose. So in his book, when he mentions a relative or a loved one who has passed on, and you saw an example of that in the first paragraph that he was reading, when he mentions a relative or loved one who has passed on, their name is immediately followed by the phrase, may he rest in peace, or may she rest in peace. With his mother, he writes it not once, but twice on two different occasions. And I actually wonder if maybe you had it more in your prose and they asked you to maybe take it out if it was excessive. But now, if you're Iranian, you probably already know this, so bear with me. If you're having a conversation with someone and they mention a friend or family member who has passed away, in the middle of their sentence, you'll say, Khuda biyamurzeteshun, or literally, may God forgive their sins. But if we want to anglicize it, it would be, may they rest in peace. To which your speaking companion will respond, Khuda raftegan shoma ram biyamurze, which is, may those you have lost also rest in peace. This will all happen mid-conversation. It's second nature, and it's perhaps almost a knee-jerk reaction, but it's still intentional. And what in quote unquote polite speech might be considered an interruption will feel like a moment of collective prayer, I think, after which the conversation will continue. And it doesn't matter if you believe in God, that's irrelevant, you'll still say it. And it doesn't matter if the person wasn't that nice, like your Aunt Gohab, apparently. So this is just one example of subtle moments, I think, in his book where I see him creating within that space between the sacred and the poetic, a prose that is itself intimate, poetic, sacred, and critical in how it captures the experience of a nation. So I'll go back briefly once again to the text message by my friend, where she uttered the word sin. I don't know what sin or gunah we have committed in this godforsaken place, uttered by a non-practicing and more or less non-believing Muslim. But this is, in my reading, an example of the prose that you have created in your book. So returning to Mahmoud Darwish, you write, on the surface, Darwish's memory for forgetfulness, or De Khuda's remember the dead candle, is a meditation on the brutality of war and tyranny. But they also bring together the personal and collective memories of people and their nations into each other's prose, poetry, and proximities. And this is precisely what I think Hamid has done too, bringing together our personal and collective memories into a shared prose that oscillates between the seemingly clear-cut boundaries between Persian and English. And in this process, as you say, he has transformed the Persian of his childhood in an English that he has, in his own words, taken from the colonial tormentors and made his own. So one thing I would perhaps suggest in terms of a conversation or a question is that there are subtle differences in the prose that you create and perhaps the prose of even this text message or my generation. And I think that has to do with growing up in the Islamic Republic and how that might affect the tenor of our prose, sometimes in subtle and sometimes not in so subtle ways. So for example, in your book, you say, I was born into Islam, but Islam was not the totality of my world. In some ways, we didn't really have that freedom, let's say, and we have perhaps a more complex relationship with Islam that is maybe not always positive. And another thing, and in that vein, well, I'll actually come back to this at the end, but it perhaps could be somehow a follow-up question. Now, you read this at the beginning of your remarks, and you would be, I think you would be quick to assert that this critical memoir of your childhood is not representative of an entire nation. We heard him read in the opening pages of the book. In this book, I wish and I plan to tell the story of an Iranian childhood, not the Iranian childhood. Who am I to say anything like that? Just one Iranian childhood, which is my own. But a few lines later, you add, but my telling of this childhood is the mature decision of a writer who is convinced there is something in this prose that resonates with the whole history of a people, a nation, a country, a clime, a region, a world. And it does resonate. Not simply because of the all too familiar details of about family dynamics, childhood crushes, worshiping soccer players, but also because of the power and the right it grants to the knowing post-colonial subject to narrate their own history. And this is where I would like to come back to that seemingly or otherwise innocuous statement at the beginning of these remarks, I am here. As Hamid Dabashi is thinking through the contours of this aforementioned relationship between the personal and the political, and imagining how the individual I might be able to write or speak in a manner that could encompass the collective we. He remembers a video he's seen of James Baldwin giving a speech in London, and he quotes Baldwin. But what one does realize is that when you try to stand up and look at the world in the face, like you had a right to be here, when you do that without knowing this is the result of it, you have attacked the entire power structure of the Western world. Reflecting upon this powerful moment as you write, you add the key phrase here is quote unquote without knowing, for that is the implied and entirely unintended consequence of the moment when James Baldwin's or my I rises simply to declare itself. At this moment, you have this uncanny fear to realize that if you as much as utter the word I am, an entire civilization may crumble. So your own articulation of this powerful moment in Baldwin and this last sentence that I read that gives me goosebumps created for me a most powerful moment in your own text for me. I am here. You came to the US when you were 25. Sorry, I didn't know this would happen.
Have a sip of water.
Thank you. I came when I was 28. I am, among many other things, a product of Columbia University's English department and its Institute for Comparative Literature and Society. And I'm sitting with two of my mentors from these two locations within the university. And this is for me both a homecoming and maybe a eureka moment. Now, Bruce, you probably don't remember this, but no, I promise you, it's all good. So I came to your office. I think it was the first time I came to your office. We were chatting and you asked me, this was my first year of grad school at Columbia. You asked me what I was specializing in. And when I said postcolonial studies, you asked me, what my thoughts on the field were. And I hope you don't remember what I answered. I don't remember what I answered. I remember stumbling through it. I was very nervous. I thought I couldn't answer the question adequately because I didn't have the necessary academic know-how yet. I also remember in that same first semester, I was in a master's seminar and I kept hearing the name Adorno come up. And I'm like, who's Adorno? I had never heard his name. And it really made me question my place there. I was wondering, what am I doing here? And I sometimes tell my students this and they think I'm joking, but I say, I seriously thought that Columbia had made some mistake in admitting me. I always, kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. This imposter syndrome really was very real. But about a decade later, with the help of Hamid and his formulation of the postcolonial knowing subject, I can sit here somewhat confidently, I'm still working on it, and see the value and contribution of my past knowing, of my Iranian knowing, with its humanity intact, to the formation of this present self, looking at the world in the face, to quote Baldwin again, as a knowing postcolonial subject, or at least someone who is on the path to knowing, who is still learning. So this maybe last question I have is something you say, and again, it's not a question, it's something I would like us to think about more. You write about how a new generation in your epilogue of readership is emerging in and out of Iran, in and out of the Orientalist field of Iranian studies, who are yearning for a prose that cuts to the chase of what a childhood would look like beyond the recollections of their own parental generations. And I think yours really does cut to the chase. But I was also wondering about perhaps a misplaced anger that my generation now, especially during these last maybe decade or so, has towards your generation because of that a revolution that effectively was hijacked. At the same time that reading this prose, there's nothing but tender feelings there for that childhood. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, both of you, Bruce and Arthur. Most thoughtful and real, and I certainly learn how to read the text. Thank you so much. Hamid John, that's your turn.
Where to begin? First, a note of gratitude. If I am the author of this book, Ali Mirza Qasi is the godfather of this book. Without his accepting this book for his series and encouraging me to write, he and Arshin, as you can tell, Cambridge University Press, press of this sort with this kind of prose, would have been impossible. So I'm very grateful to Ali. Bruce and I, as he said, we go way back. He may not, again, I'm going to embarrass him by what memory that he may not remember.
Both of you.
Bruce had just published one of his fantastic book about public intellectuals and such, and I was a green assistant professor at Columbia. I read the book, loved the book, and he was still not at Columbia, he was at Rutgers. So I called him and invited him to come to my department and give a talk. And next thing I know, the following day, as Bruce said, we shared love and admiration and friendship with Edward Said. Edward Said used to call us very early in the morning. So he called he called in the morning and said, "How do you know Bruce?" I said, "How do you know what?" Apparently Bruce had called Edward and said, "Who is this guy and what does he want from me?"
No. Okay, now you're bullshitting. I'm sorry. This is anyway.
At any rate, then he and I became colleagues and friends, and we taught together, we made troubles together, and all sorts of things. And then the other secret story is that some of the Oedipal issues of my daughter towards me has been transferred to Bruce because she, as Atife knows, is now an emerging star in her field. Atife I have loved and admired and been following her work since she was a graduate student, and now she's our colleague. And her panache for comparativity, which is the result of my colleagues in English department, Brent Edwards and other colleagues in the department, is a blessing for me to see them read my prose so closely. The thing about this book is that, like all of you, I have always been full of these childhood memories. We all are full of childhood memories. But since I began and wrote it from here to there, I found myself, I no longer remember these memories. I remember them if I have to remember, I remember, but they don't come naturally to me. They used to come naturally to me. I would just tell my kids, I tell my friends, but in a way they have just kind of left me. Ali says something about the history of how this book came about. I was listening to a Palestinian friend, Ismail Nashev, talk about in Doha, we were in Doha, talk about his book that he had just written, Tufula Huzayran, June Childhood, which is the story of Palestinian childhood in the aftermath of the June 67 war. And this book is about that childhood. And as I was listening to him and doodling to myself, exactly as Bruce said, I said, well, he was born in 1967. He's just like Salman Rushdie, 1947. And they're both two traumatic events, the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, the British colonialism of 1947. And then, obviously said, well, where would I be? And then, oh, wow, imagine that. I would be 1953 in Iran and the coup against Mossadegh. So this is the nucleus, sort of how this came about between Salman Rushdie and Ismail Nashev, 47, 67, and 53. But the thing that immediately came to my mind and became, and as I say in the book, crucial in my thinking is actually Walter Benjamin's Berlin childhood around the year 1900. That gave me the the courage and conviction that there is something about these childhood memories that is beyond kind of our personal issues. And not only to give a perspective on coup of 1953 from a child's perspective, what perspective do I have? As Atif said, the earliest memory that I have is soon after the coup of 1953. I must have been, what, I don't know, 5, 6, something like that, that my mother sent me to buy some grocery. And when crossing the street, there were a group of thugs in a truck screaming, Shahanshah Piruze, Musaddiq Dayuse. Shahanshah is victorious and Musaddiq is a pimp, as Atif said. And I didn't know what's Dayus. So I went to my mother and said, you know, what's Dayus? And she giggled and said, never mind, no, did you get the parcel? The thing about, as I said in the early, the thing about writing this, there are actually, as this wonderful anonymous reader said, is that there are actually 2 authors. One is a child delightfully remembering all of these wonderful things, and then is this adult character, and we decided to put the picture of the child on the book, who kind of takes it from there and goes with it to places. So there are philosophical reflections, poetic reflections, all sorts of reflections. And then that exhausts itself, and then another memory comes. So the child takes over. And so you remember when you know, we were doing this, for example, going to, there are things that I say, for example, going with my mother to all women's public bath, something that, you know, boys did. Becoming curious about women's bodies and sort of looking and chasing at them. During high school, I was in the red light district of my hometown, sort of beginning of the budding sensuality of being both scared and attracted to to sex and not knowing what it is, what is going on. As Atif said, the most important part of this that is, I'm happy, and I don't think I can recreate it, but hearing Bruce and Atif read passages from it, I get emotional when you read it, because I no longer see it as coming from me. It's sort of this thing that is out there and has a character of its own, has a power and weaknesses of its own, has a vulnerability of its own. And the reason, as Bruce rightly said, Bruce is one of the greatest theorists of the secularity, just like Edward Said, is that I had to be honest with myself, because the term secular never satisfied me. We don't have an equivalent for it in Persian. We don't know what to say. The Arabs have created something called Almaniya. They don't know, wow, what's the root of it. We in Persian don't have, we just say secular, and or secular, as the Tehrani said. So I decided to just not use it, because I don't have any use for it, and opt for, and that not using it became extremely helpful in my, as this passage that Atif detected and read, sort of becoming more acutely aware of the environment and the space in which the knowing subject becomes aware of itself. Like many of my colleagues, I'm very critical of the field of anthropology. And this prose that they call it autoethnography, I absolutely detest that phrase, that if I say I'm doing this and that, oh, that's good, that's autoethnography. It's absolutely not autoethnography. There is an Argentinian philosopher I read closely, Enrique Dussel, who says in his magnificent book, Philosophy of Liberation, that before we have ego cogito, we have the ego conquiro, that those who have the ego cogito have already mastered the ego conquiro, the conquering subject, predicates, the knowing subject. And here, as Atif and Bruce both notice, it is a moment of a person. That's why the book is so related to my other work. A person becomes aware of the knowing I. who is this I? When I say I get up, I came in, I'm late, I apologize. How is that I related to the environment in which she, he, it, they, fortunately in Persian we don't have gender specific pronoun, was cultivated. And if there are a number of running themes, as Bruce said in the text. If there is one that is most consistent with my other works, is the fact that I am chapter after chapter, episode after episode, environment after environment. I go from literature to folklore to storytelling to childhood plays and all of that. What holds it all together is how this knowing subject, the I, is shaped, is formed, becomes self-knowing, becomes assertive. And again, as Atif has said, that is the kind of a passing of the baton to the next generation, that this is how I was, and hold it and go and see how you are. And it is in that space that, you know, going from my hometown Ahvaz to Tehran, by the money I made teaching and writing those letters and such, then the summer I was teaching this, you know, in Iran, we did an exam in June, and if you fail the subject, you could take it again in August. So between June and August, my cousin Hossein and I had a very lucrative business, teaching anything, chemistry, algebra, English, Arabic, you name it. So I made a bundle of money, and I didn't know what to do with it. How many James Bond movies can you go and see, and sandwiches? So I gave it all to my mother, and she saved it for me. And then when I sort of was about to go to Tehran to go to college, he also had her alanguz, her bracelets, right, from her dowry that she sold and added to the money that I had, became this much money. It's just like the Goodfellows, you know, the money is just this much money. We became this much money, and she was scared. I mean, my family didn't have a sort of a check or a bank account of that sort. So she was scared and convinced that somebody will steal my money between Ahvaz and Tehran. So she sewed it into my pants. So I sat on my money on the bus between Ahvaz and Tehran. So somebody had to blow me off my ass if they wanted to steal my money. That money, half of it from, you know, my writing composition and love letters and teaching algebra and I think, and half of it my mother's dowry, is the money that sustained me in Tehran. Ali remembers when he was writing his memoir, I keep telling him, where did you get your money? And he get upset with him. What the hell are you asking this question? Because I knew that I only could survive for about 6 months in Tehran. And in Tehran, when we were to buy sandwiches, for example, sandwiches, those who were, you know, had money, they would say, take all the dough out of the, you know, the bread. So they wanted all the, you know, material in it, meat and vegetables and this. But those of us who were hungry and couldn't eat, we wanted the dough inside the thing to be thick. And I had a friend who we once went to buy a sandwich together, and he in a joking way, he said, take the dough out of mine and put it in his. This is why, you know, the source of money, and thus the significance of Gorky's childhood. Gorky's trilogy, the first one is about his childhood, became definitive to how I, as an immigrant, I mean, more as an immigrant laborer, really, in Tehran rather than a student. Yes, I was a student, I was active, I doing long live this and that and all of this as the rest of us, but more really as a child, a teenage laborer, that I had to work, and if I didn't have work, I couldn't put a roof over my head. But all of this I say without any sense of kind of victimization or denouncing the Pahlavi this and that. There was something Gorky-esque in this. That is, you have to read Gorky's My Childhood. Amazing, extraordinary work. So as Bruce noticed when he kindly endorsed it, it is also a very bookish memoir. It's full of books. I was reading this and I read the other thing. Because books were the cheapest entertainment and cinema and radio. So in a way, it's an archaeology, archaeology of that, the 1950s and 1960s. Technologically, sort of what sort of a material culture we had, that then at some point, I say the death of assassination of John F. Kennedy was really more important for my cousins and so forth than the June 1963 uprising of Ayatollah Khomeini, which was really more a Tehran and a Qom proposition rather than Ahvaz proposition. My young female cousins were all in love with John F. Kennedy and were singing, songs for him. So there is an aspect of the materiality and ephemerality of the culture in which this childhood has happened, and fortunately, sort of the prose has come together to register it, to give it life, to give it credence, to give it relevance that is not part of our standard historiography. Ali's own biographical prose in the book that just came out, Loneliest Revolution, is in a similar sense, because he is writing about the Iranian Revolution, but from a perspective and an angle that is nobody writes about. Both he and I and Ervan, we have all written about the Iranian Revolution, but kind of you put an archive in front of you and say, "Oh, this is what happened and how it goes." It's in my own estimation, it's is a moment of psychological barrier out of it that I had to overcome to sort of say, "This is I am, and here I am," and put it between two covers, and we'll take it from there. There are more stories, but no longer of the 50s and 60s. But right now, I just read and endorsed this magnificent book, Subversive 70s, of what's his name? Michael Hart. Michael Hart. Yeah, Michael Hart. Yeah, but you're right. Negri wrote a Subversive 70, but it was more a reflection. Michael Hart just wrote a wonderful book, Subversive 70s, about the event of the 70s. So I have a story to tell, a sequel story to tell about my life in Tehran as an immigrant laborer, really, that my closest friends were also somebody from Tabriz who had a thick Turkish accent. And talking to girls, are you kidding me? We couldn't put 3 sentences together if we came anywhere near a female classmate. Ali Nourouzi and I were close. He came from Tabriz, I came from Ahvaz, and we were very close. There is a sort of a whole fraternity in it, in a sense. So as I have said multiple times, Ali Nourouzi was very well versed in Marxism because of his growing up in the North. And we'll go for long walks, and he will give me lectures about historical materialism is this, and the dialectic is that, and so forth. And to this day, if I were to think of Marxist terminologies in Persian, they come in Turkish accent to my ear. Materialist dialectic, یعنی اینکه شما در جهان دو نیرو داری، یه نیروی زیر. That's all Ali Nourouzi's. So that life, that it's subversive 70s business, that is not all, student activism and this and that, is actually a different side of it, is also a story to be told. I thank you for your patience. I'm extremely grateful to my distinguished colleagues, Bruce and Atife, for gracing this book, reading it, citing it, reflecting. I wish I could just sit down and hear you talk.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Wonderful. Any comments that Bruce or Atife?
How do you get to be so charming?
You should see me in faculty meetings.
Probably not, actually. No.
Well, nobody is charming in faculty.
Yeah.
You remind me of something, and that's Kennedy's assassination.
Yeah.
I was in elementary school. Went to school. I was in the outside in the on campus with other little boys, and this was in the morning, and we were waiting for the announcement that school starts, go to classes. Wasn't happening, and we didn't know what was happening, but there was something very unusual. And a couple of older kids. At the time, I thought the oldest people can get is the 6th grade. To me, they look so tall and everything. Said, "Oh, they killed Kennedy." I remember this, but of course, I did not connect Kennedy's association and us not going to classes.
Yes, yes.
And an hour or 2 hours probably passed. Then the principal came. Apparently, he was preparing a speech. Gave this speech, and we all started crying. Well, remember, there were these 2 kids involved.
Yeah.
I had a friend whose name I don't know, who said, "Oh, Mom, yatim shudim."
We became orphans. Oh, wow.
I say this, first of all, to confirm what you said, and secondly, to also say that I think, and I hope most people in a way that Paul Ricoeur calls this, being faithful to your memory. We write our memoirs because there are lots of fake memoirs out there too.
Oh, of course, yeah.
There are even sometimes I read of people of my own generation. This is really are people who lived in Iran during my time, and I sometimes cannot recognize that. These are not personal family stories, but significant moments. And I feel that, who are these people? I want to make a comment that is not about Hamid's book, but when you were a little emotional, and then you discuss your first experience at Columbia. I have a more embarrassing story to tell you. I was much older. I wasn't old, but much older. And it was after I got my PhD. So I don't have the excuse of saying it was my first year. So my plan actually was, I came here to be here for 2 years and go back. And wasn't able to go back. And I also thought that I'm doing fine. I got a PhD, got a ticket, realized that my password is not good. And I went to renew my password. They confiscated something and they interrogated me and said, "Oh, this is on TV, it's fine. You will not see Iran until you die. Maybe just added to Iran, maybe." I didn't know what to do. I had no plan in terms of staying here. We had a very, very a great person as chair of our department, and I went to him and I said, "This is what has happened." He said, "Oh, don't worry, you are a good student. You would get an academic job here." I said, "I know, but what do I need to do?" He said, "You go and write a cover letter, and then I tell you." I said, "Sure." I didn't know what cover letter was. I said, "If I write something, why do I cover it?" I remember I went, a classmate of mine is somebody who some of you may know, Val Muqaddam. And I said, "Val, I have a question. I know it's stupid, because the way the chair department said, this is something I should know. But
Was it covered?
he wants me to write something and cover it." He said, "What is this?" I said, "Cover letter." And he laughed. There was tear in her eyes. I said, no, this is a request letter. So I have to tell you that these are the stories. Any questions and comments or anything about the book or about what have been said? Brian.
Yeah, I just want to ask a question about kind of growing up in Avaz. I don't know if you covered this in the book, but you talk about you know, the kind of the coup and the kind of figure of Mossadegh. I was wondering if you, in your like awareness of oil, the industry, and kind of what it meant, if it was more of a local experience, kind of a connection to the oil industry.
Oh, I have us particularly.
Or to the Persian Gulf, or was it always a national or like global thing that was more abstract?
Yeah, I talk about not oil, but about labor unions. Because Ahvaz is a cosmopolitan city. And also mostly consisted of labor migrations. Doesn't have sort of too much of its own population. People come from around the country. And the way that, again, I describe the labor union, because labor unions were illegal, they couldn't actually form a labor union. But they came and they established a mosque. The Isfahani mosques was very near to us. My dad was from Bushehr. They had a mosque, Bushehr. But the mosque functioned like a union in the sense that all these migrant laborers that had come from Bushehr and they were in this mosque, they were to get together and do all the things that you do in mosque. They pray, they mourn for Imam Hussein and all of that. But at the same time, they informed each other about what to do in terms of organizing, raising their salaries, and etc. I share a funny story that one of the things that, for example, laborers did, they faked another marriage. So my dad would go and said, I've just married another wife. So because for each additional wife, they will get, some extra money. And that was good money. And then after a while, my dad was scared witless of my mom. There was no other thing. But this imagined wife will start having imaginative children. So soon, because each additional child, you had a little bit more money added to your salary. So one thing led to another. Based on my dad's certificate, he had 2 wives and 5 children, which means he was entitled to a full train car all the way from Ahvaz to Khorasan. So as Atif and Bruce know, this is one of the funniest and most hilarious and lovely memory of mine, because then my aunt Batul and my cousin Hossein and Sharifeh and Fatane and I and my younger brother and my mother and my dad will all have one thing to ourselves. 3rd class, but who cared? Because you had the pillows and the things on there. Are you kidding? But there was this scary moment. There was this scary moment that I would be just shaking when the conductor came to check our Tian, and I was scared that he would realize this is my aunt Batul, is not my dad's wife. To this day, I'm scared of train conductors checking tickets. So, but they were my dad's friend. They knew, they were all doing it. So they will come and they say, oh, Mashtadi, oh, you have a new wife. Tajid Faraj kardi, congratulations. And my poor Aunt Batul will pull her chadar, as Iranians do, this way. Oh my God, what is happening? Then this will take for a few minutes and go on. At any rate, we'll go to Khorasan and come back and all of that. So yes, I talk about that, but not oil, because the center of oil was Abadan. Not Ahvaz. Ahvaz was more related to the train station and railroad that was a station there, and other sorts of industries. So particularly important was the formation of labor unions. And these labor unions came from the entirety of the region, not just Iran. They came from northern borders of the Arabian Peninsula. They came from East Africa. They came from southern India. They came, of course, from the Arab world. And there was a lot of sentiments, for example, from Gamal Abdel Nasser. Again, I say not entirely jokingly, my dad loved to listen to Kulthum, drink his vodka, and cook for us. and I've inherited that, but instead of Kulthum, I listen to Ella Fitzgerald. The thing is that he was sort of very dark skinned and laborer, and my mother very fair skinned and quite pretty, so he couldn't believe that his luck that my mother has a different story. So he bring his salary and give it to my mother, and my mother will give him some sort of money for a bottle of Smirnoff vodka and some tobacco for his cigarette. And then he would be happy for 3 weeks of the months. And through that 3 weeks, he was a staunch Mossadegh nationalist. Muhammad Mossadegh, great man, this and that. Until the 4th week, he ran out of vodka and he ran out. He would become a Nasserite socialist. Great man. So, as I say in my other book, we had a blind mullah, Mullah Jawad, who was a devotee of Khomeini. He would come and first do the thing for my mother, then he would start singing the praise of Ayatollah Khomeini. But he came on lunar calendar, and my dad received his salary on solar calendar. And depending if my dad was in the anti-colonial nationalist phase or third world socialist, they would have a debate about various issues. That would be my education, my political education, between blind mullah, and these blind mullahs are very important because they were blind, they could go into private quarters of families. So militant Islamism of Mullah Jawad, and my father oscillating between anti-colonial nationalism and third world socialism, that's really the political culture of Iran of 1960.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Yes.
Question might be long, but I just have a lot of thoughts. So I mean, when I was in during my undergrad years, there was this professor who also grew up in Iran before the Islamic Republic, and then he loved telling a story about how he used to drum rolls with the girls in school, or learning about Israel, like their friends, something like in the school. He loved telling us the stories. And then one day, like another professor who also been to Iran before maybe 78, also she just told me that before and after, a lot of books we read in the States, or a lot of movie like perspectives, like those kind of story that we are so familiar with. It's not the reality that after the revolution, a lot of people in the countryside they experience. They actually benefit a lot from the new regime. So my question is more like, so if because I'm from China, I feel like growing up, I am losing a lot of things compared to a lot of people in my age from different area. They are gaining a lot from the understanding stuff. Like I don't know, but I just think if I'm doing like a similar project in the future, how am I going to fill all this gap and that everyone?
The trajectory of people's lives are different. Right now, because of the political situation, there's a nostalgia for the Pahlavi regime, that things were really wonderful and sort of, as Atif said, all my responsible as if I was for the revolution. I still am for the revolution. I still am for the next revolution. But revolutions don't happen because we will them. But multiple factors come together for a revolution to happen. Nobody is responsible. But there is a legitimate, because of the atrocities that have happened over the last 4 to 5 decades, legitimate nostalgia for the Pahlavi regime. But also the fact is, despite the fact that there were limitations, censorship, all over that, my generation, we had again, as Atif rightly says, we had a much richer and more fulfilling childhood and youth. There were things happening, and there was a romance for revolution that was not just in Iran, romance of revolution for all we identified with all uprisings, Algerian uprising, Latin American uprising, Che Guevara was our hero. I remember when for the first time, I think I talked about this, saw the word Che Guevara in Persian. When you write it in Persian, it looks like Che Guevara, oh, how delicious. I didn't know what the hell is that, Che Guevara. Wow, how wonder how delicious. So there was this romance for global revolution that Latin American, Cuban, Algerian, Vietnam, identification with the Vietnam. So that then was because of that we invested our hope, aspiration in this revolution and refused.
Cold War.
Cold War. We refused to believe, to accept. And as I say in my book on Iran and People Interrupted, we were not careful what we were wishing for it came true. The generational issue, again, as Atif put it so beautifully, is very, very crucial. My sort of generation, which is sort of Ali's and my generation, is more, in a different way for Bruce as well. Bruce, I would strongly recommend Bruce's interviews with Edward Said. You see, there is an issue right there that is across faith and sort of a post-Christian and a post-Jew reflecting about secularism.
I want to talk about my childhood. How much patience do you have?
Go for it.
Another hour? No, that was a joke. I did actually have one, because we are the same generation, actually, within months.
Yeah.
But I was raised here. And boy, is it different. It's a different generation. Even though, for me, the formative political experience was anti-imperialism, but it was anti much more than it was pro, which is to say, I knew that the United States only supported evil regimes.
Exactly.
Right? And that's a strong thing to know, but it's a negative thing to know. And it didn't really mean that I had to find out much about anywhere else.
Yes.
And there's a kind of weakness to that as a political formation,
Very good.
which reading your book made me think about.
Yeah.
Because here we both are anti-imperialist, but with very different versions of it.
Yes. You see, the thing corroborating what Bruce is saying from the other angle, my generation grew up reading Pablo Neruda, Mahmoud Darwish, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Nazim Hikmat, Vladimir Mayakovsky, all in Persian. I have an essay. No, I'm just calling them key poets. And Langston Hughes, all of them in Persian, because we didn't know English or any other language, Spanish, etc. That is what I mean by romance of revolution. That Mayakovsky, because I was in St. Petersburg for a film festival jury. I hang out in Mayakovsky's neighborhood, and what he was doing. Anna Akhmatova was ours. I mean, Anna Akhmatova was as dear, as close as Furugh Farrokhzad. And that's something that, again, as Bruce says, there was a embracing of the world that happened. Langston Hughes. I read for the first time Langston Hughes being cited by Ahmad Shamli, remember, in a poem. Well, how the hell would I know who is Langston Hughes? So, yeah, one of the early mornings that we will wake up is to watch Muhammad Ali play a thing. We didn't have television. My aunt had my uncles had television, but we had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to watch the match. And then Muhammad Ali became our conduit into understanding a whole larger frame of reference and the civil rights movement. Yeah.
And I want to add something to this, and that's the context. During my lifetime, our lifetime, which is second Pahlavi, there was a very systematic censorship of Iranian news and even history. But newspapers and magazines and even some radio programs, these are all state either owned or sponsored or sanctioned media covered the revolutionary events in the world extensively and in detail. So in some respect, when I say Cold War, what was available to us was limited, but it wasn't just it was limited. Certain things were more available to us. I became an intellectual or political by hearing the news of what was happening outside of Iran. In fact, one of the surprises for me was, I think this is in my book, when just before revolution, there was opening and I went to a Tehran University literature school. There was a big gathering and a couple of prominent Iranian Marxists gave a public talk. Zarafshan was the main, Nasser Zarafshan. And there was this discussion about a troubling relationship between Muslim revolutionaries and Marxist revolutionaries. And there was a really good discussion. This was the first time I heard this. And I was a graduate of Tehran University Political Science Department. Our professors were not allowed. When I say our professors, I don't mean a particular professor, because in fact, many of our professors were pro-Shah. They were not allowed to teach Iranian political history after Mashrute. And the access we had, like we had more experienced political people who would give us Marxist books, but not really a book about Iranian political history. The eye-opening moment for me was just before revolution. Yes, in fact, I endorse what Bruce said. Your book is really about education, but it's also about what was available and what was not. In some respect, it was very cosmopolitan, what was available to us, very worldly, which was, everything you said. But in some respect, it was limited. Limited because, so we too learn anti-imperialism, but it was, the other side was already there. It's not that we didn't have any choice that we have.
And just one point about Bruce, about education. The second volume of Gorky is my university. But the paradox is that he never went to university. It just means, he's growing up and sort of being in a cosmopolitan context. That was his university. So, which is also the book we read in Iran before we knew that there was a prequel to it called My Childhood. So I kind of had to reverse that order. So your point is absolutely correct. But it's sort of education in a larger sense, not just sort of bookish and such. At any rate, thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hamid John.
My pleasure.
Writing is wonderful.
Thank you.
And making this occasion possible. Thank you so much, Bruce, for I admire you and your work, but pleasure to meet you in person, and for your very thoughtful comments. And Atiya John, like always, thank you so much. You are so kind to be here and to share your thoughts. And thank you, everyone. Sorry for the delay, and thank you very much for staying and being here, and good night.